everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion. We want to hear from you, so please make sure that you say hi and drop us a line in the chat. Tell us where you're joining from. Also, as the conversation progresses, you might have some questions that come up or some comments. Please share them in the chat as well, and we'll make it a point to try to cover all those points. My name's Emma Garcia, and I am the Director of People and Culture at Zpryme, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm honored to be joined by three dynamic women who educate and elevate their communities to be more inclusive. They are each committed to challenging the status quo and to creating a more equitable world. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Angela Thompkins, who is the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Consumers Energy. And under her leadership, Consumers Energy has been recognized for its diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives by Forbes, Diversity Inc., Military Times, Best for Vets, Corporate Equality Index, among many others. And an exciting tidbit, she was featured on the Montel Williams Military Makeover Show. So these are just to name a few. But more recently, she was recognized as a 2020 Michigan Chronicle Women of Excellence honoree and a 2021 Top Diversity Officer by the Energy Inclusion Conference. And she serves on the board of directors for the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion, Equality Michigan, American Association of Blacks in Energy, Empower Detroit, and the Advisory Council for the College of Engineering at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Angela. Thank you so much for being here with us. We also have Sophia Khan, and Sophia recently transitioned into a new role as Vice President of Marketing and is on the board of directors at Firetrace International, a part of the Halma family of companies. She's proud to champion for an inclusive clean energy economy by serving on the board of the revolutionary nonprofit All In Energy. Her experience spans multiple clean energy and energy efficiency organizations, including BlueWave, Perch Energy, Engie, and Clear Result, where she led marketing, product marketing, social impact, and employee engagement. Thank you for being here, Sophia. And last but not least, we are also joined by Venus V. Pinedo. She is the founder of Vector U, a diversity, equity, and inclusion coaching and mediation consulting firm born from deep industry leadership expertise at Fortune 5 companies such as Dell, General Motors, and Forbes, no, not Forbes, more recently Facebook. And Venus has over 18 years of experience solving complex business problems and managing virtual cross-cultural transformation projects and teams. And as a leader of global and cultural transformation projects, Venus knows that equity and inclusion practices optimize an organization's capabilities. She works to increase the representation of underserved communities in tech through community and nonprofit involvement. Thank you so much for being here, Venus. So, according to Indeed, job postings in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging rose 56.3% from September 2019 to September 2020. Additionally, LinkedIn data determined that the number of people with the title Head of Diversity increased by 107% in the last 5 years. DEI has become a top priority for many companies, and one would argue that we are past the point of explaining the business case for DEI, but that is not the case. There are still a lot of companies that are struggling with this. So let's start off with covering why is creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy a sound business decision? Venus, can you start us off, please?
Absolutely. Well, I think like you just mentioned, if you go to your googly fingertips, you will find so much data about the impact of diversity and inclusion on employee retention, employee engagement, innovation, productivity, there's so much research around that. So I think that from a business case perspective, there's a well-documented data-based information that you can rely on when people want to hear about the business case. And I think more and more people are moving away from the just a business case and understanding some of the broader context. Like I mentioned, employee engagement is something that could be difficult to quantify. And yet we know that if you have low employee engagement, it's costing your company about $3,400 out of every $10,000 in annual salary. So there are some very real consequences of not having an environment where everyone feels like they can bring their full self to work, where there is diversity of thinking, of experiences, of background. We see difficulties when you end up with a groupthink, which is kind of this psychological effect when a lot of people that are thinking or viewing a problem the same way just want to agree with each other. So if you're in a company that requires innovation to move forward, you end up paying a very high cost from having a homogeneous group. So I think just touching on some of those different pieces make it an I would say an inarguable case for why diversity, equity, inclusion is very, very important. And there are so many more. I mean, we're not even talking about the aspect of, because it is the right thing to do as human beings, to value each other, include each other. And Emma, I know I think you're going to provide some resources for folks that don't want to go through the googly fingertip research.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that, Venus. And just so that our audience is aware, we will be sharing a spreadsheet with resources for you to take away at the end of this webinar. And thank you, Venus. Sophia, would you like to add anything to that?
Really quickly, specifically from my really phenomenal time working with both Perch Energy and BlueWave on this topic, that we found that we were able to take DEI beyond kind of an internal lens into really how were we doing business with our partners, communities, business investors, and bringing that more into both our value prop, but how we were consciously interacting with those parties, both to affect our business line. And as Venus said, the right thing to do. We started off there thinking this is all very related to climate change, and those companies were quite fervent about addressing climate change as kind of part of their reason of being. And we saw it as there was no way to really move the needle on climate change without also affecting these parallel and equally related systemic issues. And I'll say that where I'm moving into now, the Halma group of companies, they have a very similar philosophy, even though they're more on the manufacturing side, that sustainability and DEI are one and the same efforts, and they're rooted at the core of how everything's being built in those organizations.
Thank you both for highlighting not just the business case, but also the moral imperative for implementing DEI initiatives. Angela, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Before I start, I just want to thank you for having me, inviting me to be a part of this awesome discussion with both Venus and Sophia today. So I am honored to be here. And I'll add that, to what both of the women have already said is, the employee piece of it, the talent attraction and retention is important for that, employee experience piece, the external, our customers. And what I think we often forget, because we get so caught up in the representation, is that our customers are diverse. And so ultimately, we're all in business to serve our customers. And so if we don't have happy, engaged employees or coworkers that feel like they belong, that they have a sense of purpose, it's that innovation that was spoke of earlier, the outcomes that our diverse customers are expecting and seeking from us. And so as we have business solutions, as we serve the community, if we don't have those happy and engaged employees, we're certainly not giving and providing the best to the people who are relying on us the most, and those are our customers.
Thank you. Excellent point. It's not just about providing grid resiliency to the customer, is it? Thank you so much, Angela. What pitfalls can we help others avoid when creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion program? Angela, can you please start us off there?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Several examples to speak from. One of the things, that I often like to share with others on the DEI journey is that the journey must really be unique to your company and your culture. And I think oftentimes there's a lot of pressure from leadership and just from wanting to do things right. You want to move fast. You see some of the great things that other companies are doing. And there's oftentimes this instant need to replicate what another company has done. We want to move very quickly. There's a sense of urgency. All of that is good and true. But some of the pitfalls that we experienced in trying to do that ourselves is one, it became another thing because we weren't unique to our culture. We weren't on a parallel path to our values, to who we were. We were just trying to do something that sounded good. Representation was one, for example. We sincerely would like to move the needle on our representation and do better. And so we had some plans in place, and this is what we're going to do to increase and improve representation. And it didn't quite work because what we failed to do was first create the business case, the awareness, the understanding why it's important, that it's not just about closing that gap in representation, but it's changing the system. So what does our interview process look like? What's the language in our job? Is how do we even get here? And so looking back at what problem are we truly trying to solve? And we often focus on diversity, but if we focus on inclusion, or the diversity is the outcome of inclusion. And so where we really failed is that, I don't want to say we were forcing because we had great intentions, but we have roughly 9,000 coworkers. Each person comes to the table every day with a different understanding, experience, expectation in this DEI space. We were trying to move forward as one company with 9,000 different expectations, right? And so I think the first place to start is to honor the different experiences and expectations, and you can't move forward until you move forward together. And that takes some work to create that baseline and the foundation. What are the terms? What does this mean with, 9,000 different people? There's 9,000 different meanings and, understandings of what it is. And so we had to, after moving quickly over a couple years, we had to intentionally pause and take a couple steps backwards to say, when we say diversity, this is what we mean. We mean every single person in the company. Diversity is about differences, and differences show up in a lot of different ways. Differences are not isolated to, racial and ethnic minorities and gender, right? Differences shows up in experience, expectation around work-life balance. There's diversity in all different forms. And so we first needed to have that conversation and separate it from underrepresented groups, because that's, I think, where a lot of our people were when we said that word diversity, which really prevented us from getting the outcomes that we truly wanted. And so really, I would encourage people to honor where you are as a company. There's no right place to start. The right place to start is the right place for your company, not what everybody else is doing. That's a sure way to fail if you start and do what everybody else is doing, because your culture is unique to your product, your service, your employee base. And so really honor your culture and give yourself grace and time, that you can't change culture overnight. And this is essentially, what we're doing is we're changing culture. And so really allow yourself some time to get everything done. It won't happen overnight, and it's okay.
Thank you, Angela. Venus or Sophia, do either of you have anything to add to some of the points that Angela brought out in terms of pitfalls that you might help other organizations avoid?
I wanted to add to something that Angela said. So she said, basically, it is not a one size fits all. And I think along and related to that, and there's an African proverb that I love. It says, if you want to go fast, go along. If you want to go far, go together. And by honoring where you are as a company, then you are able to bring along everyone in that journey. So I know that there's always this desire to go fast and do things and show that you've done a lot of things. But if you aren't able to bring the whole company, and diversity, equity, and inclusion are so deeply ingrained in the DNA of a company, that being able to bring everyone through in that journey can really mark your success or your failure, at least until you learn those lessons, right? So just being very aware of where you're at as a company. And then the other part is communication, right? In my previous life, I did a lot of project management. And I will always tell project managers that I work with, don't let perfect get in the way of good. And when you apply that to communication, I think that as we are driving such an important initiative for the company, we always fall into the temptation to not communicate until we have it right. And because it is a journey, you are going to have many ups and downs and left and right, and you're going to figure out many things as you go. So having that open and transparent communication about where you are, why you're doing it, why some things aren't working, and what are you doing to correct them, really helps to build that unity in moving again, everyone together. So communication and transparency, even when you know there's 1,000 more things that you need to do, you can also share that and share these are the things that we're prioritizing and this is why. And then that way you open to information from your community that will help you shape your next steps.
Thanks, Venus. I'll add a few things just from obviously work we were doing at Perch and at BlueWave, and then we had communicated quite boldly what we planned on doing. We didn't get to all of it. But one thing I learned was that there were several other smaller and medium-sized companies who just didn't know where to start. And so they were kind of frozen. They also felt like they weren't experts on this. This was talking about race, and I'll just say openly, they felt like we're a bunch of white people and we don't know what is right for us to do, and we can't necessarily afford to get a phenomenal expert like these two other women. And I, from talking to those other organizations and with the work we did at our organizations, I felt like there was a pitfall of wanting, maybe as Angela was saying, to get it right, but also being afraid of taking some initial small steps. I felt that something that worked well for us was just death by 1,000 paper cuts and doing small bits and not freezing from kind of the discomfort and fear of this massive topic. Another pitfall, I think, is just kind of something Venus and I were talking about yesterday, which also relates to what I just said before. If you don't get some input from others who may be in a very homogenous group in your leadership, that you might have a very narrow view of what it is that you need to do. And then it may not work as well if you're not getting some sort of input from the communities that you're serving or the customers that you're working with or your employees of whatever level of diversity. Those are a couple of the things that I think were pitfalls. And then the last one is just, in addition to the really awesome data you put out at the beginning, Emma, I also read some data, and I don't remember the numbers now, unfortunately, but how many companies last year in the wake of George Floyd's murder had made all these massive commitments and set aside massive budgets to this work. And then don't quote me on this, but I feel like out of this massive budget, that at the end of last year, only 5% of it had been actually used for anything. So I feel like for whatever reason, we didn't quite follow through as a corporate world, and perhaps we can do better at that. And that's another pitfall. And my last thing I just remembered, not really a pitfall, but a challenge that we had to work through often, especially as in smaller companies. How do we build mechanisms so that when we have to make business decisions and we feel like we're really challenged between whatever amount of money we were able to put into DEI or something really feeling really dire on the business side, how do we make decisions there and not compromise on this? What identifying and working through what's the right balance there was something we found ourselves having to address quite a bit.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you so much. And hopefully one of the objectives of this webinar is to provide tools for people to be able to follow through and implement. It is the DEI journey. And you mentioned that somewhere along the way, a lot of these companies that committed to implementing DEI initiatives didn't follow through, and maybe they just lost their way along the journey or came across some roadblocks and didn't know how to move forward. And hopefully we'll be able to provide some tools to help mitigate that. Thank you. So what role would you say culture plays in developing a DEI strategy? Angela, you talked about the 9,000 individuals at Consumers Energy. How do you keep everyone in mind and use culture to help develop a plan?
Yeah, so I'll answer your question with a pitfall, another one. So we've been at this work for many years, but it was about 2.5, maybe 3 years ago that we realized we had no DEI strategy. So we were doing a lot of things in the DEI space with good intentions. We were, in hindsight, reacting to our environment. So as our coworkers were, bringing up issues, we responded, we addressed. And one year we were preparing for the board of directors meeting, and DEI was on the agenda, and we kept referring back to our strategy. And I, had been leading this work, and my boss kept saying our strategy, and I was afraid to ask, like, what is our strategy? I don't even know what our strategy is. And so we just kept saying our strategy. And so finally I got brave and I said, what is our strategy? And she kind of looked at me and she's like, yeah, you're right. We don't have one. But I share that to say, it's important to really step back, take the time. And so our core values as a company, we embrace, or we, do all of our work with care. That is just foundation to what we do. We're a caring company. Any decision we make, we say, what would a caring company do? And so we have these 5 culture values. Care is one of them. DEI is a part of all of them. But we really use those 5 culture values to then build an intentional DEI strategy. How do we support the business, roadmap, work plans for 5 to 10 years? How do we make that connection to our culture so that it's not just something else, again, that we do as a company, but that it's part of our DNA? Like, utility energy company safety, right? It's foundational. It's a part of every single thing we do. And so how do we create that in our space for diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so what we decided is that diversity, equity, and inclusion would be embedded in our culture as just a part of the company's DNA, like safety. So it's not about representation. It's not about moving numbers. It's about who we are as a company. It's just who we are. And so what we decided as we built our strategy is our strategy has 3 different pillars. Talent and culture are 2 of them, which I think are not unique, but our 3rd pillar of our strategy is process. That DEI will be embedded into every single process in the company, not just through people and culture, not just people processes, every single process. And so we're working on that now, multi-year plan, but to have every functional area review the standards and processes that they use on a daily basis to perform their jobs, and review that through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that it truly is, it's just who we are and what we do. And I'll tell you some of the small, and I hate to call them small, but maybe easy wins and quick wins that we've had in this space. One function had a list of vendors. The approved list of vendors was called the white list. The list of the vendors that was not approved was called the black list. As that team started to look at their work through the DEI lens, they said, you know what we're unintentionally reinforcing that white is good and black is bad. How about we just rename our list the approved list and the not approved list? And so it's all of the 9,000 owning DEI and the outcomes in our processes. So if we want systemic change, that change has to come through our processes. And so we say DEI proficient people, we create the processes, create DEI proficient processes, which then yield the DEI outcomes that we want. So when we think about DEI being a part of our culture, is first, do you even, have a company define culture and values? Maybe you even start there before you start with your DEI strategy, right? And how does DEI complement that? And how do you move along on that journey to make sure that they're in parallel and in sync with one another? We often use the parallel paths to our safety journey. There's never no end, right? We're never going to just say we're done with safety. Same thing with DEI, same thing, we use our customer journey. We're never going to be done satisfying our customers, hearing from our customers. Same thing with DEI. We're constantly evolving. It's a journey with a destination never to be reached. There's always going to be work to do, but what that work is will change as we advance and get better and make improvements. But what's most important is that the work that we do in the DEI space does fit our culture and who we are. And who we are a company that cares about our coworkers. We care about the environment. We care about our communities. And so that's the foundation in which we really built our DEI strategy. And now we actually have one.
Thank you, Angela. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that on the prep call, Jessa mentioned that you had to get buy-in from each individual at Consumers Energy. You have a signature from everyone that has committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We do, and that was something that we launched just this year, actually, as a part of the ongoing conversations throughout the organization, that it takes all of us to realize the outcomes of our strategy. And so we created a pledge. There's many, external pledges out there with different organizations, but we created a pledge that, again, is unique and specific to us, that aligns with our core values. I see you and you belong. And it's a commitment that we've asked each one of our employees to sign that DEI commitment statement. We will review it and have everybody sign it again in 2022, but we're all in this together. And if we're looking at creating that environment of inclusion and belonging, it takes all of us. It's not just the leaders in the company. It's not just one group or another group. It takes all of us. And what we're really trying to accomplish is that environment of inclusion and belonging. In order for us to get there, I see you and you belong is the foundation for us to get that done.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and take this opportunity to also thank Consumers Energy, because you provided that pledge to us as a resource for attendees to be able to take away. And obviously the wording is specific to Consumers Energy, but they'll be able to use it as a guide if they're interested in creating a pledge for their own organization. So thank you for that. Venus or Sophia, would you like to speak a little bit about the role that culture plays in shaping a DEI strategy?
Go ahead, Venus.
Okay. Well, I want to connect it to something that Angela said, which is one of my favorite words in the English dictionary. I speak Spanish and English and dabble in French and Swedish, and there's always words that come up that have so much meaning. And for me, is the word deliberate. Culture is something that you have in a company, whether you know it or not. Culture is what people do and people say when nobody is watching. So being very deliberate from a company perspective and laying a foundation of what is and what is not acceptable norms of behavior is very, very critical. And that comes across, like Angela was saying, in your policies and your procedures, in education, making sure what language is acceptable, what language is not acceptable, in hiring processes and interviewing, salary allocation, performance assessment. All of these things are some things that companies can do to set in writing what the expectations are of every individual in the company. And now sometimes you might change hearts, sometimes you may only change behaviors. You can only be responsible for changing the behaviors. And by having these things very well defined and articulated and accessible to everyone is one of those things that can really help shift a culture, or making sure that there is no question mark as to what is expected as belonging, to an organization. And then the other part of culture is, it's simpler said than done, but it's really our own behaviors. As an inclusive organization, a diverse organization, people are always looking at how people behave, especially I think managers and leaders can have a great influence by just seeing how do they manage meetings. We are in meetings, from 8 to 8 sometimes, and every meeting is an opportunity to display inclusion. Who speaks first? Is everyone being heard? Who is determining the contents of an agenda? How are you making sure that there are diverse perspectives in that problem solving? So there's some things that happen on your everyday life that will be greatly shaping the culture, which is the DNA of your company, and moving it towards the company that you've decided, the organization that you've decided you want to be.
Thanks, Venus. I would add, specifically in this case, from the lens of the smaller companies who may be listening, who are startups or more of a technology and innovative aspect of their journey as an organization, that there's a need to, so in our experience with Approach and BlueWave, these were newer concepts to us, not because we've never talked about them, but we never formalized them and never decided how far to go. And when we had our moment of truth last year to decide how far to go, there were a couple elements of our culture that were really crucial. One was our most senior leaders, who were not very diverse. Our most senior leaders needed to take a moment and deliberately choose to be uncomfortable and deliberately choose to say, we're going to do this. We have learning to do. We can acknowledge our problems, measure them, change them, but we're going to take the first step and say, we're going to do this and we don't know how yet, but it's this important to us and we're going to let the whole company know about it. That kind of at the top leadership level that determines the culture to make that decision. Then the other thing is, in a startup culture, there's also this, particularly on the clean energy side, there's an element of having a lot of really passionate people who want to see societal change, and they may already be quite socially active in these areas, and allowing the culture of innovation and the culture of activism to permeate into this aspect of your company's work also could be very impactful by empowering your people to do so. And then finally, just the level of collaboration that you allow, rather than, in my experience, or maybe this is my own personal belief that I keep forcing on everyone I work with, that the more we create a collaborative environment to solve these larger systemic problems, the more effective those solutions are, because many of these problems arose from having smaller groups of people in control of larger groups of people. And I don't mean not having bosses. I mean that when we come to solving these particular issues, that if we consider everyone's experiences, everyone's input as equally valuable, I think that's an aspect of culture that's really powerful here.
Thank you, Sophia. I really appreciated what you said about your leadership at the previous organization being willing to be uncomfortable and say, we know that there's something that needs to be fixed. We don't know exactly how we're going to do that. And that kind of goes back to what Venus mentioned. Venus, if you could remind me the phrasing, exact phrasing, it was something about don't wait for perfect when good is enough.
Don't let perfect get in the way of good.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's move on to what, and when an organization commits to DEI, and so if you can think of this as like a microcosm within the macrocosm of the community that organization is a part of. What are the ripple effects? Like, what do you see are potential societal impacts? Angela, what have you personally seen at Consumers Energy serving your customers and implementing the plan that y'all put in place last year?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, because going back to being deliberate, having a strategy, our strategy for DEI is both internal and external. And so as we developed the strategy, we were very intentional about a couple of things external. One, as we look at all of our processes across the company, that also means communications, marketing, right? All of our brand channels are going to look at their processes through that DEI lens. And so what was some of the things that we've done intentionally for the community is we looked at our philanthropy. And while, we had some very great initiatives, we've supported a lot of great causes, we did not or were not intentional with our giving in terms of DEI. It was, again, we were reacting to requests that maybe came in. And so now we've shifted, and our philanthropic arm has a very deliberate now strategy in how we support our communities from a DEI perspective around racial and social injustice, what that means for us, how we show up, how we support the communities, our volunteerism. Again, we didn't have a specific DEI strategy in how we showed up and supported communities in terms of volunteerism. I talked about earlier, again, that process lens, operations, right? The core of our business, we service our customers. Well, how the heck do you do that through a DEI lens? Well, I'll share with you some of the work that we've done. Our operations team, and again, on their own, without being led by me or someone from my team, they, took the charge seriously to look at their work through the DEI lens. And they said, of course, with a partnership across the company, but we service the entire state of Michigan. We want to make sure there's equity in our service. And so what they did is they mapped by zip code the entire service territory and overlaid diversity demographics. So what zip codes may be income challenge zip codes, what zip codes may be minority communities, what zip codes may be communities of affluence, and so on. And so what we did then was look at our work plan in terms of outages and restorations. And do we have certain communities that experience outages more frequently than other communities? When we go to restore, are certain communities getting restored faster than other communities, right? And so really looking at, from that customer community lens, how we service, ensuring there's equity to all of our customers, regardless of the diversity dimension. And so, so happy to share that we had no disparities in terms of, we even looked at our spending. How are we spent infrastructure, replacements and repairs, investments, based on those zip codes. And gratefully, we had no disparities. But when we talk about servicing our customer in the history of our 130 plus years as a company, we've never looked at our work and how we service our customers through that DEI lens. And so we're doing that across the entire business, all functions, to ensure that our customers, we think about energy efficiency, products and services, the digital thermostats, you market that to, I just even use not even a diversity demographic. I think about my own father. When we talk about a Nest thermostat, you market that very differently to my 73-year-old father who says he needs to turn on the internet, like it's a light switch. You have to market that very differently to him than you would maybe, a 25-year-old recent college grad that's purchasing their first home. The messages and how you communicate, right, those products and services are different. And so, we're looking at all of that through that DEI lens. And how do we even bring people on to trust us as a brand, to move forward with us in support of our clean energy plan, different messages, right, for different demographics. And so that is, how we're looking at, our customers in the communities and how we service and support through that lens of DEI.
Thank you, Angela. And I thought about that core value that you mentioned that Consumers Energy has, is to be a caring company, to care. And if you're approaching this initiative through that lens as well, and then thinking about how you're creating a more caring environment and your customers will be more caring as well. That's a really beautiful ripple effect to imagine happening. And I hope that's the case there in Michigan. And Venus or Sophia, would you like to add some of the potential social impacts that you hope to see and that you would expect to see?
Sophia, go ahead.
Thanks, Venus. You're so polite. Yes. One is that we found previously at BlueWave and Perch that we were able to consciously think about, yes, we're talking about DEI and justice within our work, but how can we make the clean energy industry more diverse in the long term? So we ended up based in Boston. We get interns every year, and they're all from what I'll say rather elite schools, and many of our leaders are also from very elite schools, and we tend to think, oh, we need to get someone, let's make sure we get someone from this MIT program or whatever it may be. We made a decision to really expand where and how we were getting interns, where and how we were doing mentorships, so that we were starting to connect more with maybe local community colleges, and with some of the less, I don't know what the right term is, some of the more inner city schools as well, for our interns, starting to do more mentorships across our school, across the company. And we also started participating in kind of job shadow days. These were all online, but really presenting to various groups of students, what are some of the different job paths that you could have if you consider taking on a career in the energy space, as well as here are the 10 people that presented to you, and we will be your network from now on. If you ever think about coming into this industry, talk to us. And to me, that was really profound because it's part of the legacy. Like I said earlier, the clean energy space, super well-intentioned, relatively white, relatively male in terms of its leadership. And this was a way that us and other similar companies, or we and other similar companies, could enhance the connection that young people have who may not have had professional connections before because their parents were not, or their network or their community is not in this kind of space. They're getting some education, and we're also just lighting the excitement for them that they could make an impact in this kind of space. And they don't have to be, they could be an accountant in a company like any of ours and be making an impact. That was one of the really most special kind of repercussions for me that we really were able to bring about and are still practicing bringing about. And then the other is just this session and other sessions like it that will happen, this sharing and kind of building on each other's learning so that we can amplify our impact, I think is really profound as well for our industry, because we aren't just in our little bubbles like my company did this and we feel so good about ourselves, but how do we bring all of our other colleagues along that are in different stages? And then finally, just the level of innovation that comes about and the little things that you see come about and how you can really integrate this into how you're building products. Who are you choosing to be your marketing partner or anything? In BlueWave's case, they also expanded into how do we start acknowledging the indigenous people on the land we're building solar panels, solar farms on. There were all these different new ways of thinking that were just starting to come about. That's really awesome to see. Venus?
Yes. Oh my gosh, you guys gave me so much to think about. When you're thinking about the ripple effects of what you do and what is that, the butterfly effect? You never know what the consequences are and how it affects the broader ecosystem. When you implement a D&I program in your company and you put on that lens, you start seeing things that you didn't see before. And so in every function that you're in, product management, manufacturing, facilities, you start seeing things that you didn't see before. And that many times has a direct connection to the bottom line of the business. Like Angela said, how are you serving more equitably your customers? And sometimes you're going to see that there's things that have not been as inclusive with your customers. And by making some of those changes, you actually gain a broader customer base and you make everyone be able to take the most advantage of the service or the product that you're providing. So by changing or by providing that lens for all of your community to see through, you end up having those ripple effects, whether it's with your suppliers, with your customers, with your family. I want to say that it's kind of like an acumen that you learn. You might have financial acumen, communication acumen. There's all these business acumens that you learn. When you learn these things through the culture of the company, you end up exercising that muscle, and you exercise it not just in your company, at work. You bring that to your personal life, to your families, to your communities. And now taking the other extreme example, when I was talking about you can't change hearts, but you can definitely put in some of the boundaries of behavior. Sometimes people say, well, fake it till you make it. Well, many times for people that don't see the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they start practicing these behaviors, there is an aperture. The way that I like to see it is like, it's like a camera. Once you open the lens a little bit, then light can come in. And that little bit of light then creates an opportunity for people to reflect about their personal lives, even if they, outwardly might say, I don't think this is a big deal, or I don't believe in inclusion, whatever that might be. That aperture cannot be just closed when you go back home. And what that causes is to start a reflection process where again, people that might have been in one side of the fence through practicing the behaviors of D&I end up being more open and seeing more things that they didn't see before. And then I want to end this by and this topic around the Ripple organization, because I heard you say, Sophia, we're kind of activists, and our company was open. They had the intention to be different, although they were a very homogeneous group. This is kind of an effect where culture in broader society is affecting our companies, right? We are in a situation where for the first time, we have 5 generations working side by side. And you have a very powerful millennial generation that has grown up with a hunger for information available at their fingertips. They believe in their individuality. And there's some research that says that they believe so strongly in valuing the individual that they sometimes don't follow the social media mandates of the company because they feel like this is part of who we are. So you are also facing situations where the culture is impacting the organizations. It's something to really keep in mind as you have a broader workforce that are millennial, that have these different attitudes towards work. Again, how do you make the best out of everyone coming together and that generational diversity? So there's ripple effects going in both sides, in both ways.
Thank you, Venus. Yeah, and I would add the Gen Z population that's entering the workforce is playing a big role in pushing this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging forward because they're demanding it.
Yeah.
So we are approaching our last question, but I do want to take this moment to acknowledge our attendees. I see you, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, and please feel free to add a question or a comment in the chat if there's something that you're wanting our panelists to address. We'd love to hear from you. So last question from me is, how can even small companies leverage limited resources, and what can larger organizations with greater resources do to help?
I'm going to jump in on that. Coming, as I mentioned, speaking about both Perch and BlueWave, which are smaller companies, there were so many things we were able to just do on our own by doing some thinking and a little bit of research. There was a lot that we were not able to do. Like, we really realized we needed to get some outside help when it came to some of the HR side of things and to invest in that. But for us to take a look at something like when I talked about our internships and mentorships or something like that, super easy for us to do, super easy for us to make a commitment. Our communication around it, when we started actively communicating around, like Juneteenth or Indigenous Peoples Day, and why we were choosing to take the stance that we did, but more so, how could we educate our employees and encourage them to share that information with their networks so that we could all kind of move along on that journey a little bit together. There were a lot of things like that that were easy for us to do. I believe that conversations like this, again, makes it a bit easier to just reach out to other people. I know for sure I will be bothering Angela and Venus often from now on. I'm so happy to have met you both, to have these conversations and learn from each other easily. And finally, one thing that we had joined a group called Branding the Green Space, and I know there are some groups like that around the country who are actively working on bringing all of the different forms of diversity into the sustainability world. And there are just so many brilliant people in those groups who are doing amazing work that I never would have heard of if I hadn't been in that group. And just to learn their lessons, to hear how they're working in wind and they need to get, they need to have their supply chain diversified by a certain extent if they expect to win a certain bid that they're addressing, how they're working with schools, all sorts of things that I wouldn't have learned otherwise, that are just free information, and all these brilliant minds that you can learn from joining these kinds of groups. And I know Venus had mentioned that with 3D printing, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I thought it was pretty brilliant. You mentioned that, Venus, that you're working with a similar group for 3D printing.
Yes. Well, let me answer your question, Emma. Like, what can small businesses do, and how can large businesses help? I think the first part is educate yourself, right? There's no excuse for you not to understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, what are the terms? What do they mean in a business sense? What do they mean in a personal sense? And reflect on this. Reflect on the connection between these concepts in your business. How do they matter to your business? Because making that connection is one of the most critical things that nobody can do but you. And then the next thing is, for a small company, as you are growing, develop these rules of thumb for some of your most critical people practices. right? Ask yourself the question, how is this process including or excluding a group or an individual? How are my personal beliefs or biases being reflected in this? So things like the wording for your job postings, where you're finding or attempting to find candidates, what is the criteria for success in your performance evaluations? Um, what is your cultural statement, and what are your explicit and implicit norms of behavior, like your employee handbook? And then as you're growing, make sure that as you onboard employees, everyone has exposure to these norms of behavior and to your beliefs and what you've connected in terms of the concepts and your business practices and business success. And just think about, you don't have to boil the ocean, right? You can't. You're going to go through it at your pace, and as long as you're communicating, you are going to be successful. For larger businesses, like Sophia mentioned, we've been working with the Diversity Council in a very innovation-heavy industry. And what they're finding is that by creating these learning communities, people are able to advance together, learning from each other, from the pitfalls. And for those large companies that have the benefit of resources that they can invest specifically to D&I, share your process. Share a little bit of how the sausage is being made, because we tend to see all these stories of success, but you're like, how did they get there? Where did they fail? Where did they succeed? What was left along the way? So really being able to share that experience is invaluable to smaller organizations.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, and I think this advice is for both small and large companies as you begin your journey, in the DEI space, that I would recommend that you not even start with the personal diversity dimensions. So don't start with race or gender, or don't start there. In order to get everyone to see themselves as a part of, to start with work. Start with work processes, making sure you have the right people in the room when decisions are being made, to include the thinking that leaders just aren't making all the decisions and then rolling it out. The people closest to the work have the best solutions to how to improve the work. So are they a part of those decisions and discussions? So starting, very small and away from, the self ID, because we all will eventually get there. And I think those are a little bit harder for people to embrace. And so if you can just get everyone to see themselves and start with that diversity of perspective, experience, and making sure everyone feels included and belonging. So inclusion is really where I think you should start. But oftentimes companies go right to diversity. Diversity is the outcome of inclusion and belonging. That once you can, understand your unconscious bias, once you understand the business case of diversity, why it's important, your decision making starts to change. Once you change decision making, the outcomes ultimately change. So starting really with inclusion, I think both large and small companies, and it doesn't take a budget to do that.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much. So just rather quickly, we've got about 2 minutes. I do want to address some of the questions that came in through the chat. So Sarah from Los Angeles wants to know, what's the best way to ensure that your organization knows that your DEI journey is authentic and thoughtful, and not just for show and to meet the status quo?
So I'll quickly just, step in. I can't stress enough that before you even start a DEI strategy and journey, you have to make sure you have your culture, your values, and be very clear of what that is, and connect your DEI strategy and journey to that company culture and value. So when people can see that connection, it feels authentic and genuine to the company versus something we're trying to do and replicate that maybe another company has done. So I can't stress enough that it has to be, that culture needs to be defined first before you begin your DEI journey.
I'm going to add just one quick sentence that, again, I pulled from my project management days. Follow up and follow through.
Thank you. So as we close off this conversation, I do want to let our audience know that we really appreciate you being a part of witnessing this conversation, and hopefully you're able to take some highlights away and implement them in your community. And we will be sharing an email, so look out for an email with a recording of our discussion today, in addition to the resources that have been compiled. So shout out to Charlotte on our team who put together the spreadsheet with resources that will be going out to you in your inbox. And also a special shout out to Sophia, because she approached us to even just start thinking about creating this discussion and using this platform to be able to have this conversation. So thank you, Sophia. And thank you, Venus, and thank you, Angela, for being here. We really appreciate all the hard work that you're doing, and you really are making the world more equitable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.